In 1894, a visitor sat with a Hopi elder in the Arizona desert and listened to a story that should never have existed. The elder spoke of a place nearly 1,500 miles away, a vast inland sea where strangers once dug an incredible amount of copper from the earth. They were not his people, he said. They had come from across the water long before anyone could remember. They worked the metal, carried it away, and disappeared, leaving only enormous wounds in the ground. At first glance, it sounds like another old legend, except those wounds are real. When miners reached Michigan's Lake Superior during the 19th century, they didn't discover untouched copper deposits. They found thousands of ancient mines already there. Stone tools lay where they had been dropped. Massive pits stretched across the landscape. Even more surprising, the richest modern mines were often found by simply digging where someone else had already started thousands of years earlier. Who dug those mines? How did they remove such staggering amounts of copper with nothing but stone tools? And why did people living in the Arizona desert preserve a story about miners from a lake they had never seen? The deeper you follow this mystery, the stranger it becomes. Because this isn't just the story of ancient copper. It's the story of one of the oldest and largest mining operations in North America, and questions that historians are still debating today. The first men who arrived at Lake Superior looking for copper believed they were about to discover a new frontier. By the middle of the 19th century, stories of rich copper deposits had spread across the United States. Investors poured money into mining companies. Prospectors headed north into the forests of Michigan, convinced that one of the greatest mineral discoveries in American history was waiting beneath the wilderness. They expected untouched ground. Instead, they found signs that someone had reached the copper long before they had. As crews cleared away centuries of fallen trees and thick layers of soil, shallow pits began appearing everywhere. At first, they seemed ordinary enough, just depressions scattered through the forest. But the more the miners explored, the harder they became to ignore. The pits weren't random. They stretched across hillsides in long, deliberate lines, following the exact paths of the richest copper veins hidden beneath the earth. The pattern repeated again and again. Whenever modern miners opened one of these ancient pits, they often found themselves standing directly above valuable deposits of native copper. The people who had dug these holes had somehow identified the richest parts of the landscape centuries, sometimes thousands of years, before modern geology existed. It wasn't luck. Whoever created these workings understood the ground remarkably well. As excavations continued, the discoveries became even more surprising. Buried beneath layers of earth were countless stone hammers, many of them carefully shaped with grooves around the middle so wooden handles could be fastened securely. Some mining districts contained so many of these tools that early reports described collecting them by the wagon load. Thousands upon thousands lay abandoned exactly where they had broken during the work. There were no iron picks, no steel chisels, no machinery, only stone, wood, and the unmistakable evidence of an enormous workforce that had spent generations cutting into some of the hardest volcanic rock in North America. The more 19th century engineers surveyed the region, the more they realized they were not opening a new mining district. They were reopening one. Some of the richest copper mines of the industrial era existed only because ancient miners had already located the deposit centuries before. Modern companies simply removed the soil that had filled the old workings and continued digging where their unknown predecessors had been forced to stop. That raised a question no one could answer. If these ancient miners possessed enough knowledge to locate the richest veins across hundreds of miles of wilderness, who were they? And perhaps more importantly, how had they accomplished work on such an enormous scale without the tools that every 19th century engineer considered essential? Because the deeper investigators looked into the old mines, the less this resembled scattered prehistoric digging. It began to look like one of the largest organized mining operations the ancient Americas had ever seen. To understand why these ancient workings astonished everyone who found them, you first have to understand what made Lake Superior different from almost every other place on Earth. Most copper isn't found as metal. It's locked inside rock as ore. To use it, people must first crush the stone, build furnaces capable of reaching extreme temperatures, and separate the metal through smelting. That process requires knowledge, fuel, and technology developed over centuries. Lake Superior was different. Here, nature had already done most of the work. Deep beneath Music, the Keweenaw Peninsula, and Isle Royale lay vast deposits of native copper. Some of the richest copper mines of the industrial era existed only because ancient miners had already located the deposits centuries before. Modern companies simply removed the soil that had filled the old workings and continued digging where their unknown predecessors had been forced to stop. That raised a question no one could answer. If these ancient miners possessed enough knowledge to locate the richest veins across hundreds of miles of wilderness, who were they? And perhaps more importantly, how had they accomplished work on such an enormous scale without the tools that every 19th century engineer considered essential? Because the deeper investigators looked into the old mines, the less this resembled scattered prehistoric digging. It began to look like one of the largest organized mining operations the ancient Americas had ever seen. To understand why these ancient workings astonished everyone who found them, you first have to understand what made Lake Superior different from almost every other place on Earth. Most copper isn't found as metal. It's locked inside rock as ore. To use it, people must first crush the stone, build furnaces capable of reaching extreme temperatures, and separate the metal through smelting. That process requires knowledge, fuel, and technology developed over centuries. Lake Superior was different. Here, nature had already done most of the work. Deep beneath Music, the Keweenaw Peninsula, and Isle Royale lay vast deposits of native copper. They had freed it from the surrounding rock and lifted it onto a heavy wooden crib built from massive timbers. They were preparing to cut it into smaller pieces that could be transported away. Then, for reasons no one has ever understood, they stopped. The copper remained exactly where they left it. When 19th century miners uncovered it, the ancient wooden supports were still beneath the metal, silently preserving the moment when an unknown workforce abandoned one of the largest pieces of native copper ever discovered. It is one of those discoveries that forces you to pause. People using nothing but stone tools had managed to raise more than a ton of solid copper out of the earth. If they walked away from a block that large, how much had they already taken with them? That question has fascinated historians for generations because every ancient pit tells the same story. Someone invested an extraordinary amount of time, knowledge, and labor into extracting Lake Superior's copper, yet no one knows exactly how much metal left those mines or where all of it ultimately went. If you're enjoying this journey into one of North America's greatest historical mysteries, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we explore forgotten records, remarkable engineering, and historical discoveries that deserve far more attention than they receive today. In the next part, we'll examine just how vast this ancient mining operation really was and why its scale continues to surprise archaeologists even now. The deeper archaeologists explored the Lake Superior region, the more they realized they weren't looking at a handful of ancient mine sites. They were looking at an entire mining district. Across Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, old pits appeared one after another stretching for miles along the richest copper-bearing ridges. On Isle Royale, a rugged island far out in Lake Superior, surveyors documented thousands of ancient workings scattered across the landscape. Even today, many of those depressions remain visible beneath the forest, softened by centuries of fallen leaves, but still following the same copper veins that first attracted miners thousands of years ago. The location of Isle Royale makes the story even more remarkable. This isn't an island someone reaches by accident. It sits many miles from the mainland, surrounded by cold, unpredictable water that can become dangerous within hours. Reaching it required planning, reliable watercraft, food supplies, tools, and enough knowledge of the lake to travel back Music and forth safely. That changes how we think about these miners. This wasn't a group of people wandering through the forest who happened to find copper. This was an organized operation. Every season people had to prepare for the journey, cross open water, establish temporary camps, mine the copper, and transport whatever they recovered back across the lake before winter storms closed the season. That level of organization doesn't happen overnight. It develops through experience passed from one generation to the next. Then came another discovery that completely changed the timeline. For many years, no one knew how old these mines actually were. Forests had grown over them and centuries of soil, had slowly buried the original workings. The ancient fires had long gone out, but something survived. Charcoal. Tiny pieces of charcoal left behind by the fires ancient miners built against the rock remained trapped inside the old pits. When scientists eventually tested that charcoal using radiocarbon dating, the results surprised almost everyone. Some of the oldest mining activity dated back roughly 6,000 years. To appreciate what that means, it's worth comparing it with the rest of the world. These mines were already active thousands of years before the Roman Empire, long before medieval Europe, before the Vikings crossed the Atlantic, even before many of the civilizations we associate with the ancient world had reached their height. Generation after generation returned to the same ridges using the same methods following the same copper veins. Archaeologists refer to this long tradition as the Old Copper Culture. They have uncovered spear points, knives, fish hooks, oars, ornaments, and tools music, made from Lake Superior copper across large parts of North America. There's no serious debate that indigenous communities around the Great Lakes developed an extraordinary copper working tradition, and the archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates their skill. But alongside what archaeologists know with confidence, another question has never completely disappeared. Music. If this mining continued for thousands of years, if so many music pits were opened, if so much labor was invested, how much copper actually came out of the ground? And more importantly, where did it all go? Those questions become even more intriguing when we return to the account recorded in 1894. Because according to the Hopi elder, the people remembered for mining this copper did not stay beside the lake. They came, they worked, they carried the metal away across the water, and then music, they were gone. Whether that memory preserves a literal historical event, a symbolic tradition, or something in between remains a subject of interpretation. But as the archaeological discoveries continue to grow, the old story became increasingly difficult to ignore. Because for the first time, the evidence in the ground and the memories preserved in oral tradition seem to be pointing towards the same mystery. One question has always puzzled historians. If the ancient mines were located beside Lake Superior, why does one of the most unusual stories about them come from the Hopi people whose homeland lies nearly 1,500 miles away in what is now Arizona? At first, it seems impossible. The two places are separated by forests, plains, deserts, and mountain ranges. Yet long before railroads or highways connected North America, indigenous nations maintained extensive trade routes that stretched across the continent. Copper from the Great Lakes traveled hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles through these exchange networks. Along with goods came ideas, stories, and memories passed carefully from one community to another. It is within that context that the 1894 account becomes so intriguing. According to the record, the Hopi elder spoke of a great northern body of water where strangers extracted copper from the earth. He described them as people who came from across the water, removed the metal, and eventually disappeared, leaving behind only the scars they had cut into the landscape. They were remembered as people apart, neither the ancestors of the Hopi nor the people living around the lake in later generations. Whether every detail reflects a literal historical event is something no one can prove today. Oral traditions are not history books. They preserve memory differently, carrying important events across generations through storytelling rather than written records. That means historians approach them carefully, comparing them with archaeological evidence instead of treating them as exact chronicles. Yet this is where the story becomes difficult to dismiss. The ancient mines are real. The thousands of stone hammers are real. The charcoal from the ancient mining fires has been scientifically dated. And the enormous scale of the mining operation is real. Those facts stand on their own regardless of how anyone interprets the Hopi tradition. What remains uncertain is the identity of the people remembered in that tradition. Some researchers believe music. The story reflects distant memories of ancient indigenous mining communities whose history changed over thousands of years. Others argue that oral traditions often preserve symbolic rather than literal history. Still others have proposed far more speculative explanations, but those ideas remain unproven and are not supported by clear archaeological evidence. What makes this account remarkable isn't that it settles the debate. It doesn't. What makes it remarkable is that a story recorded in Arizona during the winter of 1894 appears to describe a place, an activity, and a mystery that genuinely existed more than 1,500 miles away. That alone is enough to make the account worth remembering. Because century of archaeological research, the greatest mystery isn't whether people mined Lake Superior's copper. We know they did. The greatest mystery is much simpler. How much copper did they remove over thousands of years? And why does so much of that story disappear into silence once the mining finally came to an end? That question has led researchers back to the same ancient pits for generations. And it is there, standing beside those forgotten mine shafts, that this remarkable story reaches its final chapter. More than 6,000 years have passed since the first fires were lit against the rock along the shores of Lake Superior. The forests have grown back. The camps are gone. The voices of the miners have disappeared. But the evidence they left behind is still there. Walk through the Keweenaw Peninsula or across Isle Royale today, and you'll still find the depressions where ancient people opened the earth. Archaeologists continue to study the stone hammers, the charcoal left by ancient fires, and the copper tools recovered from sites across North America. None of those discoveries are myths. They are part of the archaeological record, quietly reminding us that one of the continent's oldest industries flourished here for thousands of years. What remains uncertain is everything beyond that. How many generations devoted their lives to this work? How many people crossed Lake Superior season after season carrying stone tools into the wilderness? How much copper was ultimately removed from these ancient mines? No one can answer those questions with complete certainty. The archaeological evidence tells us that the mining happened. It does not tell us every chapter of the story. Music, that is where history and memory meet. The Hopi account recorded in 1894 does not replace archaeology, nor does archaeology prove every detail of the Hopi tradition. But together they remind us of something historians have learned again and again. The past is rarely preserved in a single place. Sometimes it survives in the ground. Sometimes it survives in old documents. And sometimes it survives because generation after generation continued telling a story long after the people who lived it were gone. Whether the strangers remembered by the Hopi were historical people whose memory traveled across ancient trade networks, or whether the story changed as it passed from one generation to the next, is something we may never know. What we do know is that the mines existed. The copper was real. The labor was real. And the scale of that achievement still has the power to surprise anyone who walks those ancient workings today. Perhaps that's why this mystery continues to fascinate so many people. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it reminds us how much of the ancient world has been lost. Not only beneath the soil, but also in the memories that faded before they could ever be written down. History is often imagined as a complete story. In reality, it's more like a puzzle with missing pieces. Every excavation uncovers another clue. Every forgotten record adds another fragment. And every oral tradition preserves a voice that might otherwise have disappeared forever. The ancient copper mines of Lake Superior remain one of those unfinished puzzles. A place where archaeology, indigenous memory, and 19th century records intersect, leaving us with a mystery that is still being explored today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries about forgotten history, ancient engineering, and the remarkable stories hidden inside historical records, consider subscribing for more. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think the ancient miners remembered in the 1894 Hopi accounts really were? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary.